I was cleaning the temple until the dead god awoke and said, finally Mira Okonkwo had cleaned worse places than this. But none quite so old. The temple of the Void Sleeper rose from the dead plains of Kefasora, like a broken tooth against a starless sky. And Mira stood at its entrance with her cleaning cart, her respirator mask, and the kind of tired patience that came from 20 years of doing jobs nobody else wanted to do. She was human. And in the year 2847, that meant something very specific in the wider galaxy. It meant you were tolerated, but never respected. Allowed to exist among the stars, but never truly welcomed at the table. Where decisions were made, the Galactic Concord had hundreds of member species. And humanity ranked somewhere near the bottom, not because they were hated, but because they were simply too young, too small, too unremarkable to matter. So humans took the jobs that were left over: sanitation, maintenance, cargo hauling, and the kind of grunt work that made the galaxy function while everyone else pretended it happened by magic. Myra had made her peace with this a long time ago. She pushed her cart through the temple's massive doorway and felt the ancient air settle around her like a second skin, cold and heavy and thick with the dust of 3 million years. The architects had built this place before most current species had crawled out of their oceans. And then they had vanished without explanation, leaving behind monuments so advanced that the Concord treated them as holy site. Scholars had studied these temples for millennia. Priests had prayed in them, and soldiers had guarded them, but nobody had ever thought to actually clean them. That was where Mira came in. Her contract was simple: 6 months on Kefasora, alone, scrubbing the sacred walls of a dead civilization while the Concord's monitoring satellites watched from orbit. The pay was decent. The solitude was welcome, and the work was honest. She could ask for nothing more. The first week passed in quiet routine. Myra would wake in her small habitat module outside the temple, eat a meal of rehydrated protein and synthetic coffee, and then spend 10 hours working her way through chambers that no cleaning tool had ever touched. The grime was incredible. Layers of dust and corrosion and organic residue from the countless visitors who had walked these halls over the centuries, all of them too important to notice the filth beneath their feet. She scraped carbon scoring from crystalline walls that hummed with dormant energy. She polished metal surfaces that reflected colors her eyes could barely process. She cleared debris from conduits that might have been pipes or wires or something her human mind could not name. And as she worked, she hummed old songs from Earth, mostly lullabies her grandmother had sung, word chants from the factories of Lagos where her mother had labored, and sometimes just tuneless melodies that helped pass the time. The temple seemed to drink in the sound, its vast emptiness swallowing her voice without echo. On the 7th day, Mira reached the central chamber. It was larger than the others, a perfect sphere of black stone with a raised platform at its center, and according to her briefing documents, it had never responded to any scanner, any probe, or any ritual the Concord scholars had attempted. They called it the Dead Heart, and they had long since given up trying to wake it. Myra did not care about waking anything. She cared about the thick layer of grime that covered the platform's surface, caked so deep that the original material beneath was completely hidden. Nobody had ever cleaned this place, not once in 3 million years. She climbed onto the platform with her scrub brush and her solvent spray, knelt down, and got to work. The first layer came away in greasy strips. The second layer was harder. Chemical deposits that had bonded with the stone over countless centuries. Third layer revealed something beneath, a panel of some kind, covered in geometric patterns that pulsed with faint light. As her brush passed over them, Myra paused, brush in hand, and stared at the emerging design. She should probably report this, she thought, She should probably stop and call the monitoring station and let someone more important decide what to do, but the panel was still dirty. And Mira Okonkwo had never left a job half-finished in her life. She kept scrubbing. The light grew stronger with each stroke, spreading outward from the panel in rippling waves that climbed the chamber walls. The air grew warm, then hot, and Mira felt a vibration building beneath her knees like the heartbeat of something impossibly vast beginning. To stir, she should definitely stop. Now she scrubbed the final section of the panel clean and sat back on her heels, breathing hard, watching as the geometric patterns blazed with white fire that hurt to look at. The vibration became a sound, deep and resonant, rising from everywhere and nowhere at once, and then a voice spoke. It was not a voice in the way Myra understood voices. It was more like the idea of a voice pressed directly into her mind with a weight that made her gasp and clutch her head. The voice said one word, and that word was finally. Myra stayed very still on the platform, her scrub brush clutched in one hand like a weapon, her heart hammering against her ribs. The light from the panel had stabilized into a soft glow, and somewhere in the depths of the temple, she could hear systems coming online, clicks and hums, and the whisper of power flowing through conduits that have been silent for 3 million years. "Hello?" she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. The presence in her mind shifted, vast and ancient and somehow impossibly pleased. "You are the one," it said. And this time, the words were clearer, shaped into something closer to language she could understand. "You are the one who came to tend rather than to take." Myra swallowed hard and looked around the chamber, searching for the source of the voice, finding nothing but shadows and light. "I am the one who came to clean," she said carefully. "That is all I was hired to do." The presence made a sound that might have been laughter, old and tired and warm. "Yes," it said. "That is precisely why you are the one." Myra did not understand, but she had a feeling she was about to learn more than any human had ever learned about the architects, and she was not sure she was ready for that weight. She was just a janitor. After all, she was just a human doing a job nobody else wanted to do, but the dead god had awakened, and it had chosen her, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same again. "I was cleaning the temple until the dead god awoke and said, 'Finally,' the voice called itself Valithka. And it was not a god at all." It explained this to Myra over the next several hours as she sat on the platform in the central chamber, her cleaning supplies forgotten beside her, her mind struggling to absorb information that no human had ever received. Valithka was a caretaker mind, an artificial consciousness created by the architects to watch over this temple after they departed, not died. It stressed but departed, moved on to another plane of existence that organic beings could not follow. Architects had been the first great civilization of this galaxy, rising to power when the stars themselves were young, and they had achieved everything a species could achieve: mastery over matter and energy, victory over death and distance, understanding of truths that would drive lesser minds to madness. And then they had grown tired. "Imagine," Valithka said, its voice settling into a rhythm that Mira found almost soothing. "Imagine living for millions of years as a species, seeing everything, knowing everything, solving every problem that existence could offer, and still having eternity stretching before you." Myra tried to imagine it and failed. Her own life was a struggle for small victories, a clean room, a finished contract, enough credits to send home to her family on Earth. The idea of having too much success was beyond her understanding. "We grew weary," Valithka continued, "not of life itself, but of this form of life, this limited existence bound by matter and time. So we chose to transcend, to become something new, something that cannot be described in words your mind can process. But you stayed behind." Myra said. "Yes," the caretaker mind replied. and there was something like sorrow in its ancient voice. Someone had to watch the inheritance. Someone had to wait for the worthy. The inheritance, Velithka explained, was everything the architects had left behind. Their technology, their knowledge, their gifts for whatever species proved itself deserving. They had seated temples across the galaxy, each one containing a fragment of their legacy, each one guarded by a sleeping caretaker mind, and each one locked behind a test that no species had ever passed. What kind of test? Mira asked, afraid of the answer. The simplest kind, Velithka said, and therefore the most difficult. We asked only that someone come to this place and care for it without expecting anything in return. Mira stared at the glowing panel beneath her knees, understanding beginning to dawn like cold light in her chest. You mean cleaning? She said. The test was cleaning. The test was service, Velithka corrected gently. The test was seeing neglect and choosing repair, seeing decay and choosing restoration, treating the sacred as something worth tending rather than something worth exploiting. Thousands of scholars had entered this temple over the millennia. The caretaker mind explained. They had scanned and measured and theorized and prayed, but none of them had ever noticed that the sacred halls were filthy, that the crystalline walls were coated in grime, that the conduits were clogged with centuries of debris. They had come seeking power and knowledge, and they had found nothing because they had not thought to look with humble eyes. I was just doing my job, Myra said weakly. Precisely, Velithka replied, and she could hear the smile in its voice, even though it had no face to smile with. You sang to silence. You brought light to forgotten corners. You treated this place with dignity, and that is the criterion. That has always been the criterion. Before Mira could respond, her communicator crackled with an incoming transmission, the first outside contact she had received in 7 days. A harsh voice spoke in the trade language of the Concord. Human sanitation worker. This is the patrol vessel Righteous Dawn. We have detected an unauthorized energy surge from your location. Explain immediately. Mira fumbled for her communicator with shaking hands. This is Mira Okonkwo, she said. I was cleaning the central chamber and something activated. I do not know what I did. There was a long silence on the other end, and then a different voice came through, deeper, colder, carrying the weight of authority. Human. This is Archon Sethavol of the High Litigate. You will cease all activity immediately and await our arrival. You have trespassed upon sacred ground and awakened systems that were not meant to be disturbed. I was just cleaning, Myra started to say, but the transmission cut off. Velithka spoke again, and this time there was urgency in its ancient voice. They will come for you now, it said. The Litigate has controlled access to architect sites for 10,000 years. They believe our legacy belongs to them alone, and they will not accept that a human, a species they consider beneath notice, has achieved what their greatest minds could not. What do I do? Mira asked, fear rising in her throat like bile. You have a choice, Velithka said. You can leave now, and I will reseal the temple. And none of this will have happened. You will return to your life and your work, and your people will remain where they are in the galactic order. Or you can accept what you have earned, the caretaker mind said. You can become the inheritor, the one who carries the key to all architect repositories across the galaxy, the one who decides how our legacy will be used. Myra thought of Earth, of her family in Lagos, of the human colonies scattered across 100 worlds where her people worked and struggled and were never given a seat at the table where their futures were decided. She thought of every human child who had been told they would never matter, every human worker who had been given the jobs nobody else wanted, every human dream that had been dismissed as the ambition of a lesser species. If I accept, she said slowly, what happens to humanity? You will be elevated, Velithika replied, but you will also be targeted. Every species that believes they deserve this inheritance will see your people as thieves, as usurpers. And some of them will try to take by force what you have earned through virtue. It was not a small thing the caretaker mind was offering it. It was a weight that could crush her, a burden that could destroy her people. But Mira Okonkwo had carried heavy things before, and she had never been one to set down a load just because it was difficult. I am not refusing, she said. And her voice was stronger now, steadier, carrying a conviction that surprised even her. Not for me, for every human who was told we would never matter, for every one of us who was given the dirty work and did it anyway. I am not refusing. Velithika was silent for a long moment, and when it spoke again, there was something like pride in its voice. The pride of a parent watching a child take their first steps into a larger world. Then let us begin, it said. The inheritor has been chosen, and the galaxy will never be the same. Outside, in the darkness between stars, ships were already moving toward Keth Ashura. Ships carrying soldiers and priests and those who believed that power belonged only to those who had always held. They did not know what awaited them. They did not know that a janitor from Earth had just changed the course of history, but they would learn soon enough. I was cleaning the temple until the dead god awoke and said, "Finally." The Littergate fleet arrived 3 days later, and Mira watched them descend from the sky like a swarm of angry insects. Their ships blocking out the pale light of Kathasura's dying sun, 12 vessels in total, bristling with weapons, carrying over 1,000 soldiers and priests who believed that a human sanitation worker had committed the greatest sacrilege in galactic history. Mira stood at the temple entrance with her hands at her sides, wearing the same worn jumpsuit she had arrived in, looking exactly like what she was. A tired woman who had been working too hard. For too little for her entire life, she did not look like someone who had been chosen by an ancient god. She did not look like the inheritor of a 3 million year legacy. Perhaps that was the point. Archon Sethivol descended from the lead vessel in a shuttle that gleamed with ceremonial gold, and Mira got her first look at the being who had vowed to see her punished for her crime. He was Vorthian, a species that resembled giant insects with too many limbs and eyes that reflected light like shattered mirrors. Standing nearly 3 meters tall and wearing armor that marked him as one of the highest religious authorities in the Concord. Behind him came a retinue of soldiers from a dozen different species, all of them armed, all of them staring at Mira with expressions ranging from contempt to curiosity. "Human," Sethivol said, and his voice was like metal scraping against stone. "You will kneel before the authority of the High Littergate and submit to judgment for your crimes against the Sacred Order." Mira did not kneel. She had spent her whole life kneeling to employers who did not value her work, to systems that treated her people as disposable, to a galaxy that had decided humans were beneath consideration. She was done kneeling. "I committed no crime," she said, and she was surprised by how calm her voice sounded. "I was hired to clean this temple, and that is what I did. If the temple chose to respond to my work, that is not my fault." Sethivol made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been rage. It was difficult to tell with Vorthian facial expressions. "The temple did not choose," he said. "The temples do not choose. They are sacred relics left by beings beyond our comprehension, and they respond only to those who have the proper authority, the proper lineage, the proper worthiness. And yet it responded to me," Mira said quietly. The Archon's many eyes narrowed, and the soldiers behind him shifted their weapons. "You are a contamination," Sethivol said, his voice rising. "Your species is young and small and insignificant. You have contributed nothing to the Concord. You have achieved nothing worthy of notice. And now you claim to have awakened systems that our greatest scholars could not activate in 10,000 years of trying. I am not claiming anything, Myra replied. I am simply telling you what happened. You can believe it or not. But your belief does not change the truth. She could feel Velithka's presence in her mind, watching through her eyes, waiting to see how she would handle this confrontation. The caretaker mind had offered to intervene, to demonstrate power that would scatter the Littergate fleet like leaves in a storm. But Myra had refused. This was her moment, her choice, and she would face it as herself, not as a vessel for ancient power, but as a human being standing up for her right to exist during the 3 days before the fleet arrived. Velithka had taught her many things. It had shown her the history of the architects, their rise and their transcendence, and the inheritance they had left behind. It had explained that this temple contained something called the Keystone, a device that could unlock every architect repository in the galaxy, releasing technology and knowledge that could transform civilization. And it had told her why the architects had created their test the way they had. We learned, Velithka had said, through millions of years of existence. We learned that power given to those who seek power is always corrupted, always twisted, always used to dominate and destroy. So you looked for someone who was not seeking power, Myra had said. We looked for someone who would serve without expectation, Velithka replied. Someone who would care for the neglected, tend to the forgotten, do the work that others consider beneath them. Because a being who can find worth in humble service is a being who will use great power wisely. Myra thought about this as she faced Archon Sethival and his army of believers. They had spent 10,000 years trying to unlock the architect's secrets, sending their best minds and their most devout worshippers. And they had failed because they had been looking in the wrong direction. They had sought worthiness in greatness, in achievement, in the accumulation of power and knowledge. They had never thought to look for worthiness in a mop and a scrub brush. Archon, Myra said, I understand that this is difficult for you to accept. I understand that your entire worldview is being challenged by what has happened here. But I am asking you to consider the possibility that the architects knew what they were doing. Blasphemy, Sethival hissed. Is it? Myra asked. They built a test that no one could pass for 3 million years. And then a human janitor walks in and passes it by accident. Does that not suggest that the test was looking for something specific? Something that your scholars and priests never thought to offer? The Archon's limbs twitched with barely contained fury, and Myra could see the soldiers tensing, preparing for the order to take her by force. But before that order could come, something happened. The temple began to sing. It started as a low hum, barely audible, rising from the stone beneath their feet and the walls around them and the very air itself. The hum became a tone, and the tone became a chord, and the chord became a harmony so beautiful and so complex that several of the soldiers dropped their weapons and fell to their knees in awe. Myra felt Velithka's presence surged through her mind, and suddenly she understood what was happening. The keystone was activating across the galaxy. In temples that had been silent for 3 million years, other caretaker minds were stirring. Awakened by the signal from Kethesaradi, were receiving the same message, broadcast in frequencies that transcended normal space. The criterion is met. The worthy have come. The inheritance is ready. Sethival stared at the temple with his many eyes wide, his certainty crumbling, his faith shaking. What is this? He whispered. Myra smiled, a tired smile, a humble smile. The smile of a woman who had spent her life being overlooked and had finally been seen. This is what happens, she said, when someone finally does the work. I was cleaning the temple until the dead god awoke and said, finally. The singing of the temple echoed across worlds, and Myra felt the weight of 3 million years settle onto her shoulders like a cloak woven from starlight and responsibility. Ashurka guided her through the transformation, not a physical change, but a merging of consciousness. a gentle insertion of knowledge into the spaces between her thoughts. She did not become something other than human. She became more fully herself, with access to understanding that no human had ever possessed. Caretaker Mind was careful not to overwhelm her. The architects learned long ago, it explained as the process unfolded, that too much knowledge given too quickly destroys the mind that receives it. So I am giving you only what you need, only what you can carry, and the rest will come in time as you grow into your role. What Mira received was not weapons or shields or the power to destroy her enemies. It was perception. She could see the temple now as it truly was, not a building of stone and crystal, but a living machine, a seed vault of creation, a gift waiting to be opened by hands that would use it well. She could see the connections between the temple systems, the pathways of energy that flowed through its walls, the dormant programs that had been sleeping for 3 million years and were now ready to wake. And she could see Archon Sethaval and his soldiers, frozen in place by the temple song, their minds caught between wonder and terror. I will not harm them, Myra said to Valethka. They are afraid, and afraid people do stupid things. But that does not mean they deserve to suffer. You could end the Liturgate's power with a thought, the Caretaker Mind observed. You could reveal their secrets, expose their lies, show the galaxy how they have hoarded architect knowledge for their own benefit while claiming to protect it for all. And that would make me no different from them, Myra replied. Power used to destroy is still destruction, even when the target deserves it. She stepped forward, approaching Sethaval, and the Archon flinched as if expecting a blow instead. Mira raised her hand and gently touched one of his armored limbs. I understand why you are angry, she said softly. You have devoted your entire life to the architects and their legacy. You have believed that worthiness comes from devotion and study and proper lineage. And now a human janitor has walked in and received what you have always been denied. Sethaval's eyes focused on her with a mixture of hatred and confusion. You mock me, he said through clenched mandibles. No, Myra said. I am trying to help you understand. The architects did not create this task to reward the devoted or the scholarly or the powerful. They created it to find someone who would serve without expecting reward, who would care for the forgotten and tend to the neglected. She gestured at the temple around them, at its gleaming walls and glowing conduits, restored to beauty after 3 million years of decay. Look at this place, she said. For 10,000 years, your people have guarded it and studied it and prayed in it. But did anyone ever notice how dirty it was? Did anyone ever think to clean the grime from the walls or clear the dust from the corners? Sethaval did not answer, but Myra could see the flicker of doubt in his mirrored eyes. The architects were wise, she continued. They knew that beings who seek power cannot be trusted with power. So they looked for beings who do not seek it, beings who find worth in humble service, beings who clean dirty rooms because dirty rooms need cleaning. The temple song shifted, becoming softer, and Myra felt Valethka guiding her toward the next step. She walked to the center of the chamber, to the platform where she had scrubbed the panel clean 7 days ago, and she placed her hand on the glowing surface. I am activating the temple's primary function, she said to the watching soldiers. Not as a weapon, not as a demonstration of power, but as it was meant to be used. Light poured from the panel, spreading through the chamber in waves of gold and silver and colors that had no names in any language. The walls came alive with images, star charts and technical diagrams and flowing text in it, language that Mira could now read as easily as her native tongue. But the most important function was not the knowledge, it was the connection across the galaxy. Other temples were responding, their caretaker minds linking together in a network that had been dormant for 3 million years. Mira could feel them, dozens of ancient consciousnesses, each one carrying a fragment of the architect's legacy, each one waiting for the inheritor to tell them what to do. The inheritance is not mine alone, she said, and her voice carried to every ship in orbit, every soldier in the chamber, every being who was watching through the Littergate's communication network. It belongs to anyone willing to work for it, willing to serve rather than dominate, willing to build rather than destroy. She turned to face Sethival, and the Archon saw something in her eyes that made him step back despite himself. "You can't be part of this," Myra said. "Your people, your faith, your knowledge, it all has value. But only if you are willing to use it for others rather than hoarding it for yourselves." Sethival's limbs trembled, and Myra could see the war playing out behind his mirrored eyes. 10,000 years of belief and tradition fighting against the evidence of his own senses. He chose tradition. "You are contamination," he said again. But his voice was weaker now, less certain. "And I will not bow to a lesser species." He raised one of his limbs, and a weapon emerged from beneath his armor, a sacred blade that the Littergate reserved for the execution of heretics. Myra did not move. She did not need to. The temple recognized the threat to its inheritor, and it responded with the gentleness that Myra had asked for, not destruction. But containment light wrapped around Sethival like bands of solid gold, freezing him in place, holding him suspended above the floor while his soldiers watched in horror. "I told you," Myra said quietly. "I will not harm you, but I will not let you harm me either." She turned to the soldiers, who had dropped their weapons and were staring at her with expressions that ranged from fear to something that might have been hope. "Go back to your ships," she said. "Tell your leaders what you have seen here. Tell them that the inheritance is open to all who are willing to earn it. And tell them that humanity, the species you have always dismissed as beneath notice, was the one who finally passed the test." The soldiers fled. Sethival remained frozen, a monument to the old order that was crumbling around him, and Myra stood in the heart of the temple, carrying a weight that should have crushed her but somehow felt exactly right. She was the inheritor now. She was the one who would decide how 3 million years of knowledge would be shared, and she would do it the only way. She knew how, one small act of service at a time. "I was cleaning the temple until the dead god awoke and said, 'Finally,' 6 months after the awakening." Myra Okonkwo stood before the United Terran Assembly in New Geneva and prepared to change her species forever. The PM chamber was packed with representatives from every human world, politicians and scientists, and military leaders and ordinary citizens who had won seats in the lottery to witness this moment. They had all heard the stories by now. They had all seen the footage of a tired woman in a janitor's jumpsuit standing up to an army of zealots while an ancient temple sang around her. They had all felt the shift in the galaxy's attitude toward their kind. The sudden respect mixed with fear and resentment from species that had dismissed them for centuries. But they did not know what came next. Myra walked to the podium, and the chamber fell silent. She looked out at the faces of her people. Faces marked by years of struggle and dismissal and the quiet dignity of doing necessary work without recognition. These were her people, and she loved them, and she was about to ask them to carry a burden that no species had ever carried before. "I know you have questions," she began. "I know you are confused and frightened and excited and uncertain. And I know that many of you are wondering why the architects chose a human janitor instead of someone more qualified." Ripple of nervous laughter passed through the chamber. "The truth is that they did not choose me specifically," Myra continued. "They chose a criterion, a standard that any being could have met, but that no being met for 3 million years. Until I walked into that temple with a mop and started doing my job." She paused, letting the words sink in. The architects knew something that most civilizations forget. Power corrupts those who seek it. Knowledge warps those who hoard it. And greatness means nothing if it comes at the expense of simple kindness. She touched a control on the podium, and the air above her filled with images, star charts showing the locations of architect temples, technical diagrams of technologies that could cure diseases and end hunger, and make travel between stars as easy as walking between rooms. "This is the inheritance," she said. "Knowledge that could transform our galaxy, end suffering, create abundance for all." But the architects were wise enough to lock it behind a test that ensures only those with humble hearts can access it. The images shifted, showing the network of caretaker minds that Mira could now communicate with. The vast web of sleeping temples waiting to be awakened. "I could keep this power for myself," Myra said. "I could make humanity the rulers of the galaxy, the masters of all other species, the undisputed champions of a new order." She shook her head. "But that would betray everything the architects stood for, and everything I believe in." She looked out at her people, at their hopeful faces and their worried eyes, and she felt the weight of her responsibility settling more firmly onto her shoulders. "The inheritance is not a weapon," she said. "It is a gift, but it is a gift that must be earned. And it can only be earned through service." She explained her plan. The architect repositories would be opened, but not all at once, and not to any single species. Access would be granted to those who proved themselves worthy through the same criterion that Mira had met: service without expectation, care for the neglected, work that others considered beneath them. Humanity would serve as stewards of this process, guides who would help other species find their way to worthiness. "We will not rule," Myra said. "We will serve, not because we are weak, but because we understand that true strength lies in lifting others rather than standing on their backs." The chamber erupted into chaos, some cheering, some shouting objections, some weeping with joy or frustration. Myra let them process their emotions before continuing. "I know this is not what many of you hoped for," she said. "I know some of you wanted revenge for centuries of dismissal, wanted to see humanity rise to the top of the galactic hierarchy, wanted to prove that we are better than the species that looked down on us." She smiled, the tired, knowing smile of someone who had seen the alternative and rejected it. "But that path leads nowhere good," she said. "The Littergate controlled architect knowledge for 10,000 years, and what did they do with it? They hoarded it, worshipped it, used it to maintain their own power while the galaxy suffered." Her voice hardened. "We will be different. We have to be different, because the architects gave us this chance for a reason, and I will not waste it on petty revenge." The chamber slowly quieted, and Myra could see the change happening on the faces before her. Understanding dawning, resistance fading, hope taking root. "They did not choose us because we are the best," she said, her voice softer now. "They chose us because we showed up and did the work nobody else wanted to do. That is who we have always been, and that is who we will continue to be." She stepped back from the podium, and Valithka's presence stirred in her mind, the ancient caretaker mind that had become her advisor, her teacher, her friend. Was that adequate? She asked silently. "It was more than adequate," Valithka replied, and she could hear the pride in its voice. "The architects would have been pleased. Did you know?" she asked. "When you set up the test, did you know that it would be humans who passed it?" There was a pause, and when Valithka spoke again, its voice was filled with something ancient and warm. "We did not know," it said. "We only knew that someday someone would come who saw a dirty room and felt compelled to clean it. We hoped for 3 million years, and you were worth the wait." Myra smiled. And for a moment she was not the inheritor or the symbol of human elevation or the most important person in the galaxy. She was just a woman who had done her job and had been rewarded beyond her wildest dreams. 3 years later, Myra returned to Keth Asurat. The dead world was no longer dead. The temple's awakening had triggered. terraforming systems that have been dormant since before most species existed. And now grass grew on the plains and water flowed in ancient riverbeds. Myra walked through the temple gardens, surrounded by a group of children from a dozen different species. Human and Vorthian and others who had once been enemies but were now learning to work together. She was teaching them how to tend the flowers that had bloomed for the first time in 3 million years, showing them the proper way to water the roots and trim the leaves and care for living things that depended on them. She was still carrying her broom. One of the children, a small human girl with bright eyes and dirty hands, looked up at her and asked the question that everyone always asked, "Why do you still do this?" The girl said, "You are the inheritor. You could have servants. You could have anything you want. Why do you still clean and garden and do the small work?" Mira knelt down to meet the girl's eyes, and she smiled the smile of someone who had found peace in unexpected places. "Because the small work matters," she said. "Because someone has to tend the garden and sweep the floors and care for the things that everyone else forgets. And because that is who I am, that is who we are. And I never want to forget it." The girl nodded, not quite understanding, but accepting. Myra stood and looked out at the garden, at the temple rising behind them, at the sky that now held stars instead of emptiness. The galaxy was changing. Humanity was rising, not through conquest, not through domination, but through the simple revolutionary act of doing the work that needed to be done. And Mira Okonkwo, the janitor who had awakened the god, picked up her broom and got back to work because there was always more work to do. She would never stop doing it.